All right, let's imagine for a second, the battlefield. Smoke everywhere, cannons are firing, and there's this figure on horseback, just looking over the scene, real steely gaze. It's Napoleon Bonaparte, but not the, the short, stubby guy you always see in those British cartoons.
Yeah, those cartoons.
That's right. Today we're going deep on Napoleon. And the real story, let me tell you, is way more interesting than the myth.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that whole image of Napoleon being so short, it's just completely made up. Propaganda, basically. He was 5'7",
Really?
which was like totally average height for men back then.
Huh. Wild how those images can stick around for so long, though, right?
It really is. I mean, centuries later, people still believe it.
It just shows you how powerful a good story can be, I guess.
Yeah.
But we're gonna try and get to the real story today, the one behind all the, all the propaganda and the myths. And to help us do that, we're going to be drawing on this really interesting interview with historian Dan Snow from it's from the Echoes of History podcast.
Oh, yeah. Great podcast.
Yeah, he goes deep on Napoleon's life,
Mhm.
everything from like his early days in Corsica to becoming emperor of France.
It's a wild ride, that's for sure. Lots of twists and turns, amazing military victories, and, tons of political maneuvering. This is a guy who rose to power right in the middle of the French Revolution. Just total chaos. He just knew how to take advantage of every single opportunity.
He sounds pretty slippery.
You could say that.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit to Napoleon's, younger years. He's born Napoleon di Bonaparte, right?
Okay.
On the island of Corsica,
Yeah.
which, even back then it had its own culture, its own language.
Yeah, and to really understand Napoleon, like his early life and who he became, you have to understand Corsica.
Interesting.
Like, when he first went to France, he didn't even really speak French. And he got made fun of a lot because of his accent and because he was from Corsica. And get this, at first, he actually wanted Corsica to be independent from France.
Oh, wow, that's hard to imagine, right? Because he ends up being this ultimate symbol of France.
Right. Total opposite. I mean, it shows you how he was able to change, to adapt, to kind of reinvent himself to fit the situation. And that ability, that's what really defined his whole career, really.
So we've got this, proud young Corsican guy ends up in France, right in the thick of things politically. How does he go from being kind of an outsider to like a full-blown military hero?
Well, his big break comes during the French Revolution, the Siege of Toulon. This was 1793. Royalist rebels, they were backed by the British, had taken over this really important port, Toulon. And this other Corsican officer, he was in charge of getting it back. And he knew how good Napoleon was with artillery. So this was Napoleon's chance, really his first big chance to prove himself.
And I bet he didn't waste it. What did he do? Was it like super innovative?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he could see opportunities where other people just saw roadblocks. So he goes out and rounds up all these old cannons. I mean, we're talking about cannons they found behind pubs and restaurants. And he uses them, but he uses them strategically, like brilliant placements, timings, the whole thing.
So he was kind of a scrapper.
Total scrapper. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty.
Yeah.
He'd be right there on the front lines with his men. I mean, they even melted down church bells to make ammunition. And in the end, he takes back Toulon. And suddenly, he's a hero, like a Republic hero.
And that launched his whole career.
Pretty much. I mean, he was promoted to brigadier general at just 24 years old.
Wow.
But he didn't stop there. A couple of years later, there was another big test right on the streets of Paris.
Not another rebellion.
Yep. In 1795, another royalist uprising. They wanted to bring back the monarchy, And guess who gets called in to save the day again? Napoleon.
Okay, so he's in Paris, facing down this rebellion. Does he, talk them down, smooth things over?
Not exactly. He's decisive.
Okay.
And I guess some would say ruthless. I mean, he gets these cannons, lines them up right in the streets of Paris, and when things start to get violent, he gives the order to fire on his own people.
Whoa. Cannons.
Uh,
In the middle of Paris. That's chilling.
It was brutal, no question. I mean, after that, Napoleon had this reputation that he'd do anything to get what he wanted. But it also made him even more powerful within the government. They realized they needed him. I mean, they needed his military skills, and maybe they even needed that willingness to use force, when they thought it was necessary.
So this is where Napoleon really starts to become more than just this brilliant military guy. Now he's stepping onto the political stage.
Exactly. He's indispensable now. They put him in charge of the army of Italy. And that's where he really starts to make a name for himself, like a legendary name.
Yeah, Italy, that's where he really starts to kind of revolutionize warfare, right? Like the way battles were fought, the whole thing.
You got it. That's where his strategic genius shines. Back then, armies were slow. They were weighed down by all these supplies. They needed these huge supply lines. Napoleon changes all of that. He realizes to really win, he needs to be fast, mobile,
Yeah.
and he needed to be able to live off the land.
Okay, so not just tactics. Now he's a master of logistics, too.
Yep. Exactly. I mean, he would have his troops scattered, foraging for food and supplies, and then bam, they'd come back together and strike the enemy before they even knew what hit them.
Like a swarm of bees.
Exactly. And the Austrians, they were used to fighting these slow, predictable battles, They had no idea what to do.
Totally different game.
Totally. And Napoleon, he was winning that game. I mean, the Italian campaigns, victory after victory. He comes back to France with tons of riches. He's famous. The people love him. But back in Paris, the government is getting nervous.
Right, because now he's a threat.
Exactly. His ambition, it was clear as day, and he was becoming more popular than the politicians. They knew they had a problem on their hands.
But before we get into all of that power struggle, tell me more about this new way of fighting. You mentioned living off the land. Was that really like a thing back then?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was totally different. Imagine this. Instead, these huge supply wagons just slowing everything down. Napoleon's men, they'd fan out, just take what they needed from the countryside.
Sounds chaotic.
Yeah, but it worked. I mean, they could move so much faster, so much more unpredictably. And Napoleon, I mean, the guy was a planner. He knew how to keep things under control, Plus, his soldiers, they weren't weighed down by all this heavy baggage. They felt empowered.
So he was motivating them. Like,
Yeah.
hey, win this battle and we eat.
Pretty much. They were fighting for their next meal, It made them fierce. And Napoleon, he understood people. I mean, he knew how to motivate them, how to make them feel like they were part of something big.
So a great military mind,
Mm-hmm.
but also like a student of human nature, basically. He knew how to get people on his side.
Exactly. There was a real sense of camaraderie among his troops, a shared purpose. And Napoleon's charisma, his confidence, it just rubbed off on everyone.
So we've got this brilliant military leader on the rise, crushing it in Italy. But back home in France, things are getting tense.
Definitely. And that tension, that's just going to keep building. Because Napoleon's ambition, it wasn't just about winning battles. He had much bigger plans.
He wanted power, like real power.
You got it. And his next move, it's a bold one. He sets his sights on Egypt.
Wow.
And there, he's going to face off against a legendary naval hero.
Okay, now I'm hooked. We got to hear about this, this battle in Egypt. This is great.
Oh, it's a good one.
So Napoleon is in Egypt. Seems like a pretty big gamble to me. What was he thinking?
Well, remember, Napoleon was a big admirer of the classic conquerors, especially Alexander the Great. He really saw Egypt as this kind of stepping stone to building a giant Eastern empire. Like, he wanted to march through the entire Middle East and kick the British out of India. Maybe even, cripple their economy,
So it wasn't just about grabbing land. It was about, taking on Britain, challenging their power on a global scale.
Exactly. Napoleon was really good at understanding how important symbols and these big dramatic gestures were. I mean, he wanted to be seen as this new Alexander, a guy who could reshape the world. He even brought along all these scientists and scholars with him to Egypt to document all the ancient stuff. So it wasn't just about military power. It was about culture and knowledge, too.
Wow. So he's like a conqueror, but he's also this patron of the arts and sciences. Fascinating guy.
Oh, absolutely. A real complex figure. But yeah, that whole Egypt plan, it didn't exactly pan out the way he hoped. At first, he actually does pretty well, wins some battles, takes control of Egypt. But then the British show up. Their fleet, led by, Admiral Horatio Nelson.
Nelson. Another legend.
Yeah, for sure. And they clash in this massive naval battle at the mouth of the Nile River. And it was a disaster for Napoleon. Nelson just completely outmaneuvers him, destroys most of the French fleet. Napoleon's army is stranded in Egypt, no supplies, no way to get back.
Talk about a setback. So much for marching to India.
Yeah, it was a huge blow. But it's kind of amazing how Napoleon bounces back from this, how resilient he was. He manages to sneak back to France, even though he had to leave his army behind in Egypt. But then he uses this whole defeat, to his advantage.
Wait, what?
So when he gets back to France, the whole country is in chaos. The government's weak. Nobody likes them. People are desperate for a strong leader. And who's there? Napoleon. Hero of Toulon, conqueror of Italy. And now he's back from this daring escape from Egypt. Perfect timing, right?
Right place, right time.
Exactly. He knew how to play that to his advantage. So in 1799, he stages a coup d'etat. takes over the government, declares himself first consul, and people are like, yeah, this is our guy. He'll fix things.
From general to coup leader to, what, basically a dictator, right?
Mm.
This guy, I mean, his empire just keeps growing.
Oh, yeah. But even being first consul, that wasn't enough for him. He wanted a title that really meant something that would put him on the same level as the kings and queens of Europe.
He wanted to be emperor.
Exactly. And in 1804, he gets what he wants, crowns himself emperor of the French. He even takes the crown from the Pope and puts it on his own head. It was a way of saying, I'm in charge, not the church, not anyone.
Whoa. Talk about a power move. Making a statement.
Big time. And for a while, it seemed like he could do anything he wanted. He changed the laws, centralized the government, he created the Napoleonic Code, basically modernized the legal system. And all the while, France is just expanding, taking over more and more of Europe.
So he was a dictator, but like a modernizing one, bringing in new ideas.
It's weird, right? That's the thing about Napoleon. He was so contradictory. He loved the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, all that. But he also wanted all the power for himself. He didn't want anyone questioning him.
Sounds like a master manipulator.
Yeah.
A little charm, a little force, whatever it took.
He definitely knew how to play the game. And he was really good at surrounding himself with people he could trust, people who were loyal to him. A lot of those people were his family, actually. He put his brothers in charge of all these territories he conquered, basically created his own little dynasty.
Wow. It's like a Shakespeare play,
Yeah.
All this ambition, power, family drama.
It really is. But you know how it goes with Shakespeare? There's always a downfall. And for Napoleon, that downfall starts with a really, really bad decision.
Russia.
1812.
Bingo. Invading Russia, that was the turning point. It all starts to unravel from there. It's like this classic story of hubris, underestimating your enemy, the arrogance of power, and the brutal realities of war.
I mean, think about the scale of that invasion. Hundreds of thousands of men marching across Europe into Russia, which is just, it's massive.
It was a nightmare logistically. Even for someone as smart as Napoleon, he thought he could just waltz in and take over, but the Russians were ready for him. They used this scorched earth policy. So as Napoleon's army advanced, there was nothing left for them to eat, no supplies. And then, of course, there's the Russian winter.
Brutally cold.
Oh, yeah. Temperatures plummeted, snow everywhere. His army, they were already weak, starving, sick. Thousands and thousands of them died. Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. His grand army was decimated.
Devastating. Absolutely. And that's the beginning of the end for Napoleon. His enemies, they see he's vulnerable, they team up against him, he gets defeated, forced to give up the throne, exiled to this tiny island, Elba.
Elba. That's quite a fall from grace, from emperor to, island prisoner.
Yeah, it was humiliating. But even in exile, he's still scheming, still dreaming of power. And get this, he escapes from Elba, goes back to France, rallies his supporters, and just like that, he's back in the game.
Wow, what a comeback.
It was incredible. But it doesn't last long. His enemies are still out there, and they're not going to let him take over again. They meet him at Waterloo in 1815. This time, no escape.
Waterloo, end of the story.
Pretty much. Napoleon loses decisively. His reign is over. The dream of a French empire is dead. He gets exiled again, this time to an even more remote island, St. Helena, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And he dies there in 1821.
From emperor to exile, twice. What a rise and fall.
It's a classic tragedy, really. But even though he ultimately failed, Napoleon left a huge mark on history. I mean, his conquests were brutal, but they also spread a lot of those revolutionary ideas all across Europe. He challenged the old way of doing things and, in a way, helped shape the modern world.
So he's like this conqueror who also kind of accidentally pushed things forward, even if it was through violence.
Yeah, it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
That's Napoleon in a nutshell. Brilliant military mind, ruthless dictator, reformer, and ultimately a pretty tragic figure. His story reminds us that history is full of these contradictions, and it's never as simple as it seems.
Well, we've certainly learned a lot about him today. A fascinating and complex figure, that's for sure.
Definitely. And there's still so much to learn about Napoleon. I mean, we've just scratched the surface here. There are so many books, articles, documentaries out there. You could spend a lifetime studying him and still not know everything.
Well, that's the beauty of history, right?
Mm.
Always more to discover. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive. It's been a real eye-opener.
My pleasure. It's always fun to talk about Napoleon. He's one of those figures that just keeps you coming back for more.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about Napoleon's rise and fall. But I want to circle back to some of those, those myths and misconceptions that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, like the whole short guy thing.
Exactly. I mean, come on. He was average height.
Right. Average for the time.
But somehow that image of him being this, like, tiny little guy with a huge ego,
Yeah.
it just won't go away.
Well, a lot of that comes down to the British, you know?
Oh, yeah, the propaganda.
Exactly. Dan Snow talked about how the British, they used everything they could to try to make Napoleon look bad.
Cartoons, right.
Oh, yeah, tons of cartoons, caricatures, all showing him as this short, power-hungry little dictator.
So it was a way of undermining him, basically, making him seem less threatening.
Exactly. And it's amazing how effective it was. I mean, even today, so many people still think he was short. It's a good reminder that history, a lot of times, it's written by the winners. And you always have to kind of question what you're reading or seeing.
Absolutely. It makes you think twice about all those historical figures,
Yeah.
Like how much of what we think we know is actually true.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, shifting gears a little bit, I'm really interested in this idea that Napoleon, he was this dictator, no doubt, but he also brought in some pretty progressive reforms, right? Reforms that had a real lasting impact.
Definitely. I mean, one of his biggest legacies is the Napoleonic Code. That was a whole new legal system. He put it in place in France and then a lot of other parts of Europe, too. And it standardized laws. You know, it got rid of all these old feudal privileges. It was based on the idea of equality before the law and freedom of religion.
So he's like this modernizer, even a revolutionary in some ways, right? Even though he was also this power-hungry emperor.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this weird contradiction. He's spreading these ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, all that stuff. But he's also consolidating his own power, crushing anyone who disagrees with him.
History is messy.
It really is. And I think that's what makes studying it so interesting. You have these figures like Napoleon, these larger-than-life people who do these incredible things, both good and bad, and we're still trying to figure out, like, what does it all mean?
So last question, and this is a big one. What if Napoleon had never come along? How do you think things would have played out differently?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's hard to say for sure, but I mean, without Napoleon, who knows? Maybe France would have stayed a republic, or maybe the monarchy would have come back.
Yeah, and what about Europe? All those wars, the Napoleonic Wars, they reshaped the whole continent.
Right. Without Napoleon, maybe those wars never happen. Maybe the unification of Germany and Italy. I mean, those were influenced by Napoleon's campaigns. Maybe they happened differently or way later. It's crazy to think about all the possibilities, all the different paths history could have taken.
It really shows how connected everything is, Like one person, one event can have these huge ripple effects.
Totally. And it reminds us that even the most powerful people, like Napoleon, they don't operate in a vacuum. They're part of this big web of events, forces that are bigger than any one individual.
Well, I think we've all learned a lot about Napoleon Bonaparte today.
Yeah.
What a fascinating and complicated and kind of terrifying figure, right?
Yeah, he was all of those things. A brilliant military leader, a ruthless dictator, a reformer, and ultimately, I think, a tragic figure. He's a reminder that history is full of these surprises, these complexities, and honestly, there's always something new to learn.
That's why we do this show.
Exactly.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive and that it gave you a new perspective on Napoleon and on history itself.
And hey, if you're interested in learning more, there are tons of great resources out there. Books, articles, documentaries, you name it.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and join us next time for another deep dive into the past. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.